So here we go. We're going to talk about Brazil. And in talking about Brazil, which is in front of you here, we're going to talk about, give you a little bit of background first. Brazil was a Portuguese colony that during the Napoleonic Wars, when there was issues with the Latin American countries, the Monroe Doctrine came out of that time period. It also meant that the Portuguese also lost their country and lost connection with their colonies. And so basically, the son of the king moved over and created a monarchy. Well, in 1890, a group of elites in Brazil overthrew the monarchy and began the Republic of Brazil. The reason this here is because that we're going to talk a lot about São Paulo, which is one of the two provinces circled there. And the other province we're going to talk about is Minas Gerais. And both of these provinces are the two major power holders where most of the agriculture industry, a lot of the population lives in that area of Brazil at the time. All right, so background. In 1890, Brazil became a republic. The army, along with the elites, and what I mean by elite is the rich. And in Brazil, that means a landowner, somebody who owns land has some type of agricultural business with their land, are the rich people. So when this revolution happens, where Brazil becomes a republic in 1891, with the Constitution of 1891, let's talk about what Brazil was like at that point. The population was 14,300,000. And there was a huge gap in this group of population. Of that group, 42% were mulattoes, 38% white, and 20% black. Only 17% of the population from 6 to 15 went to school. There were only 12,000 in secondary schools, high schools, and other technical colleges, and only 8,000 in a four-year college. And that's out of 14,300,000. There was a huge gap between this educated elite who worked for the government or owned land and had businesses, had agricultural business, and the illiterate masses, meaning most people. In 1872, 80% of the population worked in agriculture, 13% in services, and 7% in industry, meaning that most of Brazil was agricultural workers, and agricultural workers, as we know from our study of the United States, don't make very much. The coffee industry continued. So basically, early Brazil, sugar was the main export. Now, sugar takes a toll on land. Sugar takes a toll on the population. During this time, the average population, all the way until 1930, where changes are made, the average life expectancy of an agricultural worker, 80% of the population, was about 29. And so we can see that there's huge issues with health and poverty and things that exist in Brazil. So the coffee industry began to take over for sugar between 1850 and 1900. The sugar fell as it could not compete with its lack of with Cuba and some other places where technology was being used to process the sugar. In Brazil, there was very little technology being used, and so sugar began to fall down and coffee began to rise. There was also a rubber boom between 1850 and 1880 where they were tapping trees and using the sap from that tree to create rubber. That was 8% of the exports. So most of the exports at this point are agriculture. And we'll talk a little bit more about exports in general. So now we want to talk about the dominance of the coffee oligarchy. Now, if you haven't already got excited, you really need to get excited about Brazil and the history here, because what we're going to do, what we're going to look at, is how rapidly this country goes from a poor, export-oriented country to one where industry takes a larger role, where people become more educated, where the heavy industry begins a transformation in Brazil that is quite stark and at the same time incomplete. But we'll get there. So, the dominance of the coffee oligarchy of Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais. Basically, between 1890 and 1930, these two provinces ran the government. They took turns, basically, and each putting forth a candidate, and then the candidates would, one be from Sao Paulo, then the next year they would have a Minas Gerais candidate. And they would basically go back and forth and extend this. Now, the people that controlled the government were the 8,000 that went to college, and the landed elite, basically. The people that owned land, that had coffee plantations, that had sugar plantations, that had rubber. Also, there was a ranching group that was in Rio Grande do Sul. And so these are the people that control the government. Now, when they set up the government in 1890, they set it up giving the provinces a lot of power. And so whoever controlled the provinces then controlled the wealth in that area. And the central government of Brazil had very little power. And so Sao Paulo, basically, and Minas Gerais could rule over their own provinces, which were rich, and the government didn't take too many taxes from them. And then they were able to also control the central government, and basically the rest of these provinces had to follow along. Coffee growers, basically, by 1920, 70% of the exports that are leaving Brazil, which exporting is basically the biggest, all the income that comes into Brazil. The government makes their income solely off tariffs. All the people, anybody that's making any kind of cash crop actually sells it. Brazil has to actually import a lot of its wheat and other crops, and so they export just those crops. And because they have only 7% of the workforce in industry, a very small industry at this point, especially in 1920, that they have to bring in most of the goods. Now, we know that in 1920, there was a larger industry than before World War I because of the idea of import substitution industrialization. And we will spend a lot more time on that concept later. Okay, large landowners maintained control from 1893 on and really kept policies that undermined the growth of industry. They didn't expand the infrastructure, meaning the roads and the buildings and the electricity, and they didn't expand things that would lead to industrial growth. They didn't protect or give incentives to businesses. They didn't protect them against bringing in exports from other countries. And so basically, from 1820 to 1930, you saw a drop, actually, in the amount of industries within Brazil because they couldn't compete with outside exports and because of the lack of government support that they got. Now, despite this, the population changes or increases tremendously from 162%. And part of this was a growth in the birth rate, but it was also a huge push to bring in immigration. And over 2 million, some were brought in to the country and created a change. Brazil also became much more urbanized and industrialized, and so you start to see this major shift from the old republic of what Brazil used to look like. By the time 1920s to 30 come along, there are changes, and there's problems with the old republic. The Constitution of 1891 was really set up to allow the landed elite to control things. They undermined the growth of industry, like I said, by not funding it, by not creating infrastructure, by not supporting it. They instituted policies that squashed social economic forces. They tried to stay in control, and so they would swiftly put anybody that went against them into jail and deal swiftly with dissent, both in agricultural and industrial workers. Any type of union would be strongly put down by the army and the government. The presidential succession, like we talked about, went from one province to the other, leaving all the other provinces and even the landed elite in those provinces out of control. And that began to cause some problems. And at the same time, we also have to look at elections. Only 300,000 people voted in an average election of 17 million. Because if you were illiterate, you couldn't vote. And that illiterate clause basically kept most of the people in Brazil unable to vote. It's important to realize that although the electorate grew from the empire, it was controlled by colonials. The rural landowners basically were the ones that controlled most of the people, or controlled their little provinces and areas. And so most of the election were rigged from the beginning. And so there was very little democracy. And basically, the Paulistas, the people from Sao Paulo, had full economic dominance. They had the best soil. Most of the migrant workforce came there. They became the major producer of coffee. Turned out 75% of Brazil's industrial goods, meat products, and 80% of its banking resources. And so most of the wealth was concentrated in Sao Paulo. So let's take a look at this graph. This graph is a per capita income graph. And so what you can see is that the per capita income, was very low in 1925, rises up, drops again during, even before the Depression in the mid-20s. So you can see that there's a lack of growth all in this area right here. And then all of a sudden in 1932, you see the growth trend begin up and continue up and up and up and up. And so by 1947, you see a huge growth in the per capita income and the per capita levels that people were making. And that growth then leads to more wealth and more distribution of wealth within Brazil. This is just kind of a measurement of dollars. And you can see that most people in Brazil were making very little, and the country itself was not very rich. And you can see that the growth happens after the Depression. And we will look what happens in 1930, the changes that happen in 1930 that lead eventually to growth. Okay, so economic and social neglect. Basically, like we talked about, industry was kept down. The government spent its money and influence to keep a small group of coffee growers in power. And we'll look at that a little bit when we do the simulation. More important for the power, though, was that the army was also growing tired of the coffee oligarchy. They were getting to the point where they were tired of a group of people controlling it, where the social conditions were not getting better for most people. The industry geared towards exports. Almost all the income coming into Brazil was dependent on foreign markets. And in order to make that work, they also had to take large loans from other governments. They also brought in investment from U.S. companies and British companies. And basically, a lot of the resources within Brazil were mortgaged to European and the United States. In 1860, Brazil only had 223 kilometers of railroads. By 1885, this total had increased to 6,930 kilometers of railroads. And you might say, well, look at the government, look at what it's doing. The problem was that most of those railroads went from plantations to the coast. And there were very little communication systems or transportation from city to city within Brazil, because most of the economy worked where they would sell stuff abroad, buy imports, and they would buy some very little products within Brazil. And so most of the agriculture, or most of the manufactured goods, they'd buy from other countries. Within the majority of population was illiterate and poor. There was no education system. There was no healthcare system. There was a feudal system within the outlying provinces. They warred with private armies, worked against any type of modernization. And the feudal system is the idea that the plantation owner kind of owns and has a contract with the people on the land. And so there was just within the interior provinces, it was a very backwards way of running things and a backwards way of looking at. One of the major keys to understanding Brazil, though, is land ownership. 461 landowners held more than 27 million hectares of land. A hectare is a large group, while 464,000 owned 15 million acres. And so a hectare is several acres within it. And so 27 million hectares of land meant that most of the land was owned by 461 groups, or landowners, families that own that land, where 464,000 owned smaller coffee plantations, smaller farms. Most of the issue with a lot of the agricultural system is that they were still based on slash and burn methods. Used hoes and other hand techniques, had very little mechanization, took very little care of their land, and there was very little incentive to do so. Like I said before, over 2 million people, almost 3 million people moved to Brazil between 1880 and 1887, or 1887 to 1914. This was a huge immigration period across the globe. People were leaving Russia and Italy and Eastern Europe because of poverty, because of some natural disasters, and they were looking for new places to make. And so Brazil opened its borders to a lot of these immigrants, hoping that they would become workers within the coffee system and work in the coffee industry. This led actually to some positive developments for Brazil, because most of these immigrants actually would find land and grow products. They would move interior. They would create industry. And so they wound up working very close with that. Now, most of the urban workers were in bad conditions, had low levels of, like I said, the life expectancy was 29. The housing, transportation, sewage, and water supply trailed far behind the rapid industrial growth, or the rapid population growth, and there was some serious public health problems. There was a cleanup campaigns at the beginning of the century struck at the high incidence of yellow fever, malaria, smallpox in Rio de Janeiro and some of the other seaports. The city centers were made safer, but the workers who crowded into these beehives, they would call them corticos, small crowded houses, and then shanty towns, suffered all sorts of ailments. So here what you're going to see is a graph looking at the share of coffee within the Brazilian economy. And as you can see in 1928, when we're looking at what's going on within the economic development of Brazil, you see that over 70% of the economy, of the GDP, was made up of coffee exports right here. You see a drop, and then you see a rapid drop of the amount of which it was in the economy. But you can still see by 1938, there was still a large portion of the economy was coffee. And it goes down and rises back up. And so coffee remains a major part of the Brazilian economy, but the economy expands, and so coffee becomes a smaller and smaller part as Brazil continues to grow through the 30s and 40s. So let's look at we're going to go by this. Let's look at economic development. The economic development of Brazil is a huge thing that we need to talk about, and really leads to is the greatest cause of the Depression. Because in Brazil in 1928, there is no diversification. It's all on coffee. It's all based on exports. And so when the crash comes and they can't get loans and they can't export their products and the price of coffee drops tremendously, Brazil goes into a tailspin. So, the Bank of London and its British counterpart own more assets in Brazil than the Bank of Brazil. And over half of the banking transactions in Brazil were done by foreign banks. So the finance industry was owned by foreign companies for the most part. National debt. In 1928, Brazil had the largest debt of any Latin American country, 44% of all the debt in Latin America was owned by Brazil. The debt was created by government building infrastructure, ports, and railways to support the coffee industry or to service existing debt. Much of the industry in the cities ran on electricity funded by Light, a Canadian company. And so most of the electricity is owned by, and the expansion that they need in these utilities is totally dependent on other groups. Brazil early on developed the sugar industry, but as sugar burned through the land in the north, the power shifted south where the coffee was grown in abundance. Now, one of the problems they have with coffee is the price of coffee. And so we have to talk about how Brazil defended its coffee market, how it worked with the coffee market. Because Brazil, basically, in 1930, had regional economies built around exports. Let's talk about that, and then I'll get to the whole diversification of the economy. Exported their own specialty products to European and North American markets. The absence of overland transportation, except for the mule trains, impeded internal economic integration, meaning that there was little political cohesion, little military efficiency, and that Brazil was totally dependent on the external market for all of its wealth. Completely reliant on coffee, rubber, cotton, and to a small extent, sugar. There was no diversification in the economy, with over 70% being coffee. The national government of Sao Paulo government came to the aid of coffee growers and the defense of coffee. In 1906, there was a bumper crop, and this led to a large drop in population. And so the government forbid new coffee planting for 5 years, said no more coffee plants. It takes several years for coffee plants to actually start producing, so the actual growth in coffee continued because of old plants that were coming back up and growing, because there's a 4-year gap between planting and it bringing about coffee. The price supports introduced an exaggerated expansion of coffee cultivation in Sao Paulo. And what I mean by price support is basically what happened is the government came to the aid of coffee growers in what's called valorization. So valorization is a concept in which the government buys up the excess coffee and then sells it on the foreign market as to when the price goes up. So when price goes up, it releases some of the coffee that it has stored and then uses that money to pay itself back. Well, like Hoover's Agricultural Marketing Act, like some of the problem or some of the things in the United States, when the government buys that coffee and they sell it, they're not quite making all their money back, and so that's why they had such a large debt. Is that the government was taking out loans so that they could keep the valorization program going, and so that by 1930 they had $1.2 billion annually, and most of this was to support this valorization program. They tried to do some controlling production policies, which were somewhat helpful. Price supports induced huge overproduction, however. And by price supports, the government would buy the coffee for a certain price. And so it didn't make sense for Sao Paulo coffee growers to go ahead and control their own production. They would go ahead and sell it to the government at a certain price. And so they actually increased their production of coffee, totally ignored the no growing of coffee, and basically the overproduction of coffee becomes even a more serious problem. They also spend most of their tariff money on valorization. And so by supporting and doing everything around valorization, there is little support that goes for the other problems within the coffee. As you can see here, Brazil's basically spikes by 1929. 74% of the coffee production is from Brazil. And it would go up and down as they released more coffee, took coffee out, released more coffee, took coffee out of the share of the world economy. So what we're going to talk about actually before we end is that political problems started showing up in the 1920s. A group of low-ranking army officials who were not necessarily part of the elite, but were still like sons of government officials and that type of thing, basically rebelled against Brazil and tried to overthrow the presidency. And a group became known as the Tenentes, lieutenants. And they began to challenge the coffee oligarchy. So did anybody involved in industry. 13%. In 1920, there was 9 million workers within Brazil, and over 1 million of them were in industries. And so there was a definite group of people that wanted industry to expand. The Catholic Church began to look at the social conditions in Brazil and wanted change. And the military became frustrated with all the spending on coffee, and that their salaries were low, that their materials were bad, but the government wasn't doing anything to help the military, but they were just giving and funding more to other people. So that's the end of this. To kind of give you the background, we will talk about what exactly happened to bring about the depression within Brazil, and talk about why that brought about revolution.